All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm very pleased to present our next speaker, who actually used to be my math teacher in college, Dr. Donald Burleson, who is currently the director of the New Mexico chapter of the Mutual UFO Network, which we all know as MUFON. Dr. Burleson studied at Yale University and did graduate work at a number of other institutions, including the University of Massachusetts and Columbia Pacific University. He holds master's degrees both in mathematics and in English, a PhD in English, a PhD in English literature with a dissertation on H.P. Lovecraft. Dr. Burleson has taught at many colleges and universities, most recently at Eastern New Mexico University here in Roswell. He once held a top secret security clearance in the U.S. Air Force Intelligence. He is fluent in Chinese, Spanish, and also has a reading knowledge of French and several other languages, and Russian. Well, it's good to know. Dr. Burleson has authored a number of books about UFOs and the paranormal, including The Golden Age of UFOs, UFOs and the Murder of Marilyn Monroe, and UFO Secrecy and the Fall of J. Robert Oppenheimer. Dr. Burleson has lived in Roswell since 1996 along with his wife Molly, who is a widely published writer of fiction and poetry, and they have 5 cats together. Dr. Burleson retired with emeritus faculty status in 2007, but continues to teach mathematics courses part-time and also conducts research in the theory of matrices and linear transformations. Please help me welcome Dr. Donald Burleson.
Thank you. I promise I won't talk about matrices and linear transformations, okay? Peace? Okay. The gentleman you see on the screen there on the cover of my book is, of course, J. Robert Oppenheimer. The cover sketch is by my wife, Molly. Also, she did an interior illustration that you will see at the end of this slideshow, having to do with Oppenheimer's favorite verse from the Hindu Bhagavad Gita, and she did an illustration for that, and you will see that at the end. We're going to talk about betrayal. Okay, it's a nasty thing, you know, to have to talk about something like this, but as they say, somebody's got to do it. Even a national hero can be betrayed by the government he has served. That's a terrible comment on our national life, I'm afraid. But it's one that we have to make for the simple fact that it's true. You probably know Robert Oppenheimer as the driving force behind the development of the first atomic bomb. That, of course, is a pretty familiar story. However, it was unfortunately a period of his life that was to be followed some years later by essentially storm clouds and nasty things being done to him, and that's what we're going to talk about. There is Oppenheimer on the cover of Time magazine, 8th of November 1948. Basically at the end of the war, and of course, as you well know, the bomb ended the war, World War II. He was a national hero, there's no question about it. There had never been a national hero like that. There has never been one since. There will never be one. He was a unique kind of person. It was a unique kind of circumstance. And for somebody like this to get shafted the way he was, it is a real black mark on our whole history. Actually, Oppenheimer was on Time magazine again in the early 50s. I don't have a copy of that. He was also a major player in a super secret government activity, which has never been officially associated with him. Nothing you will ever hear any officials say anything about, because as you know, the government will give you every assurance there is no such thing as a UFO, even though they very well know better. At least they better know better, because they're not doing their jobs if they don't know better. He was involved in UFO crash retrievals. We will demonstrate that. And of course, those never happened, but he was involved in them anyway. Here's my hypothesis, that this highly classified activity concerning basically UFO retrievals was his downfall. The reasons given, essentially in a nutshell, what happened to Oppenheimer is that in December 1953, he lost his security clearance. President Eisenhower pulled the clearance, actually sort of suspended the clearance, and told Oppenheimer he would have a chance to try to get it back. They would have hearings at the Atomic Energy Commission, and he could actually kind of go through a trial sort of thing and try to get his clearance back again. And the reasons they gave were all kinds of reasons having to do with his politics and his various activities, but none of them were really the reasons that got him to that point. We're going to talk about the real reasons. They wanted him out of the loop, okay? And I'm going to tell you why. Some of the things he knew about were just extremely, extremely sensitive. And the irony is, everybody knows that, of course, atomic weapons work is very, very highly classified, very sensitive, but actually the stuff we're really talking about that got him into his difficulties was much more sensitive and much more highly classified than that. Given his, if you'll pardon the expression, pyrotechnic personality, he was kind of an acerbic sort of personality sometimes, and in all fairness, he did bring some of his problems on himself, by being really kind of harsh with people sometimes. There were folks in the dark side of government who were simply afraid to let him go on having access to the kind of information he did have access to. Here's some basic facts about Oppie, including where he got that nickname. Born in 1904 in New York, did his undergraduate work at Harvard. He actually did his bachelor's degree in 3 years at Harvard instead of 4. He was one of these left brain and right brain kinds of guys. He of course was a science major, but he also studied things like French Renaissance poetry. He learned Sanskrit well enough to read the Bhagavad Gita in the original Sanskrit, for example. He was one of those people that just, the left brain, right brain thing didn't mean anything to him. It was all the same thing, all one really extraordinary brain. He went on to Cambridge University to study with Nobel laureate J.J. Thomson, and you may or may not know that actually J.J. Thomson was the guy who discovered the electron, first demonstrated that there is such a thing as an electron. In 1926, he published papers on quantum mechanics. That was a brand new ballgame then. They got him invited by Max Born to study at Göttingen, where he developed what was later called the Born-Oppenheimer method in quantum theory of molecules. And in 1927, he completed his doctoral work, had a dissertation dealing with normalization of eigenfunctions in continuous spectrum theory. Try to say that 10 times fast. We could talk about what that's all about if we had forever. It's not an easy thing to talk about. And I have to remind you, he was 23 years old at the time he got this PhD at Göttingen University. Found himself working in the company of some really heavy hitters like Rutherford, Niels Bohr, Paul Dirac, and other people in quantum mechanics. Returned to the United States to do some teaching at Harvard and Caltech and Berkeley. And then for postdoctoral studies, he went to Leiden University in the Netherlands, and the Dutch speakers there called him Oppie, hence Oppie, and the nickname actually stuck. He liked to be called Oppie. Everybody calls him that. Oppie went on to Zurich to study with Wolfgang Pauli, with whom he did work in quantum electrodynamics. And again, at this point, even he was only 25. This guy was really making some tracks, early in life. Returned to the United States, and he did this kind of a funny teaching routine where he kind of shuttled back and forth between Berkeley and Caltech. He actually had teaching appointments at both places simultaneously. I don't know if they knew about each other. I guess they probably did. But anyway, he was. I often wondered if he found himself like on the highway driving in the wrong direction sometimes or something. Back and forth. It took some of his students with him. Some of his graduate students would take a course with him in Caltech and then run down the road and take the next course with him at Berkeley. And about this time, he had a love affair with a lady named Jean Tatlock. She was a member of the Communist Party. We're going to have some discussion about what that meant in the 1930s. That did not mean the same thing as it meant in the 1950s or 60s. It broke up. He broke up with her. She would commit suicide in 1941, just as he was getting ready to get started. Almost time for the Manhattan Project to start. Oppie was kind of apolitical, you know, for a long time, but then through her, he became kind of interested in what you might call liberal social economic issues, the so-called communism in the 1930s, but in those days that term really didn't have the political stigma that it would have associated with it later, you know. It came to the fore a number of times during his clearance hearings later on that they were treating the, quote, communism, you know, of the 1930s as if it were the communism of the 1950s and 1960s with all the international intrigue implications, you know, and all the implications about, you know, kind of being in bed with the country's, you know, enemies, you know, that sort of thing. Not the same things, but they treated those things as if they were the same. That's what was tragic. Actually, in the mid-1930s, chances are, if you were living back then and you were in favor of labor unions, you probably thought of yourself as a communist. Okay, the word just didn't mean the same thing as it did later on. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not really terribly fond, you know, of you know, leftist ideology of any kind, but I'm just pointing out that there was a great deal of inaccuracy about how those words were used in the treatment of Oppenheimer. He married Kitty Oppenheimer in 1940. Here we go again. She had been a member of the Communist Party, but a few years prior to that, she had gotten kind of disgusted with the whole thing, so dropped out of it, disillusioned with it. And Oppie was, I told you about the shuttling back and forth between Caltech and Berkeley. He kind of started leaning more toward Berkeley at some point, and finally just went over there, you know, full time. And that place was a university that really hadn't had a whole lot of activity in things like theoretical physics at that point. So he figured, this is a clean slate for me to write, and this is a place where I can start new programs, teach new courses, do things that were not done at this institution much before. He in fact worked there with Ernest Lawrence. You may know that Ernest Lawrence invented the cyclotron. So he was really kind of in on the ground floor with some of these things. And by about 1942, it was becoming clear, we were after all into the war ourselves by then, it was becoming clear that theoretical physics wasn't theoretical anymore. You know, if you're going to do physics, you had a pretty good chance of ending up building bombs, in fact. You know, it was going to have some applications like that. And he made discoveries that really kind of drew attention to him, separating uranium-235. This caught the eye of any number of important people. Increasingly, he became convinced, okay, if we're going to turn nuclear physics, you know, into an exercise in weapon design and weapon theory and so forth, we're going to have to do it in a more organized way than we're doing it. We're going to have to bring everybody together and work on it in one place, you know, at one time together under one kind of umbrella of leadership. And so in 1942, he met with General Leslie Groves to lay out plans for establishing a place like that. And they actually named it before they even knew where they were going to put it. You know, they called it they called it Site Y. They didn't even know yet. They looked at various places. They looked at Oak Ridge, for example. They decided not to put it there because of security reasons. The thing is, Oppie remembered because in his younger years, spending a lot of time hiking and horseback riding and camping in a place in northern New Mexico, atop a mountain in Los Alamos, and he had always said, my two great loves are physics and New Mexico. It's a real shame I can't put them together. And so all of a sudden, here was an opportunity to do exactly that. Oppenheimer and General Groves and two of his adjutants visited Los Alamos, and they liked the place. Actually, in a sense, they kind of liked the place too much, because it wasn't really as good a site for what they were planning to do as they thought it was going to be. It was too small, for one thing. General Groves actually thought at that time that this project, the project of developing a nuclear weapon, was going to involve, probably at the outside, about 100 people working with, for Oppenheimer, who was going to be in charge of the project. Well, it turns out that within a year, Oppenheimer was going to have 3,500 people employed working for him there. That was going to swell to 6,000 very quickly. And that's only if you count just the people that are right there on the immediate site. That doesn't count things like suppliers and people like that, scattered all over the place. And that runs it up into the tens of thousands of people who, in one sense or another, were going to have Oppenheimer as a boss. Okay, he had a lot of people working for him, and by mid-1943 they were doing it in earnest, and he turned out to be a remarkable administrator, by the way. How often would you expect a theoretical physicist, to be able to step into a position like this and run everything like a business almost? He was remarkably talented at that. But then something happened that shouldn't have. Just before they were getting ready for everybody to move to Los Alamos, this is when Oppie was still at Berkeley, a French professor at Berkeley named Hakan Chevalier and his wife came over to dinner with Oppie and Kitty Oppenheimer, Robert and Kitty, and Chevalier made sort of an overture to him. He says, I know this guy, this engineer named George Eltonton, who's interested in finding ways of conveying scientific information to Russian scientists. And I wondered if you can maybe help us find ways to do that. And basically, Oppenheimer told him to buzz off. Okay, he said, are you nuts? I'm not going to do that. I wouldn't even consider it. Don't even bring it up again. And that was his response. But he made two very serious mistakes. These were the two indiscretions of his life, pretty much. He waited several months before he told Army intelligence about it. Okay? What he should have done, right there in front of Chevalier, is pick the phone up and call him. All right? First of all, he should have said, "Get the hell out of my house." Then he should have picked the phone up, and called him right then. He did not do that, and later on, when he did do it, he declined at first to name names. He didn't actually tell him that it was Hakan Chevalier at first. Later he did, but not right away. And that delay, actually, that whole way of responding to it, came to be thought of later on as indiscretion in terms of like how he should have reacted to everything. It was poor judgment at the very least, they thought. And he admitted later on, in fact, that was true. It was poor judgment. But those were the indiscretions. Okay, no classified information was lost. Nothing was passed to anybody, illegally. He didn't do anything, that kind. But he did respond in a way not the best way. There were some people who didn't want him to be in a position of running the bomb project. Okay? They made various excuses. He was too young, and boy, talking about high standards. Some of them said he didn't have a Nobel Prize. Boy, did you ever apply for a job where you needed to have a Nobel Prize? Anyway, some of them had that as an objection to him. He had left-wing political associations and liberal leanings, even in the 1930s sense of those terms, that it kind of made some people nervous. But General Groves stuck up for him because he wanted him. He said, okay, you guys who don't want Oppenheimer to do this, you just, you go over there and kind of put your heads together. You sort all that out, okay? In the meantime, I need this guy's brain. All right? So you guys sort it out. I don't care. I need the guy's brain. We've got a bomb to build. And this is the guy that can do it. And he prevailed. He oversaw it with brilliance, and it all worked out. It was a long, hard, anybody that's ever looked at the way that whole thing transpired, knows that it was a very, very complicated and problematized sort of process. But it did work on the morning of 16 July 1945 at the Trinity site, just about a little less than 100 miles from here. Well, the sun came up twice. First in a flash so bright that a blind girl 20 miles away saw it. And the second time it was just a much dimmer object that we call the sun. Okay? But it worked. Nobody was really sure that it would, by the way. Oppie's brother Frank was there, and Frank says, Robert just kind of punched me like this and said, it worked. You know, they weren't sure it was going to. Actually, some of them thought it was going to ignite the atmosphere to start an unstoppable chain reaction. So, but of course, that didn't happen. And it called to his mind, his classically trained mind, remember, a line from the Bhagavad Gita, you know, I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. After the war, well, I'm sorry, not quite after the war yet, he was on a panel to decide what to do with the bomb, first of all. Truman had some questions as to whether we should really drop it. You know, he thought, this is really going to be terrible if we really do this, you know, so couldn't we just, like, show them we've got it, you know, and talk about it, and maybe do a demonstration for them out in the desert or something, and Oppie and the other people on the panel said, no, we built this thing to use. It's meaningless if we don't use it. We've got to drop it. Okay, and of course they did. On the 6th of August, Hiroshima was bombed, Nagasaki 3 days later, Japan surrendered, war was over, the world was a different world. He was a national hero, again, of a unique kind. And during the post-war years, he served basically in a government sort of capacity as a consultant and as you know, various jobs having to do with advisement on matters of atomic energy, including weaponry. Truman appointed him to the General Advisory Committee of what was then the brand new Atomic Energy Commission, and he became chairman of that committee. And there was a fellow named Louis Strauss. It looked like these guys were going to get along famously. It's really kind of too bad that things ended up being the way they were. But Louis Strauss was heading a committee looking for a director of the Princeton Institute for Advanced Studies. They were trying to find somebody to take that job, and Strauss wanted to appoint Oppenheimer. And Oppenheimer said a very interesting thing to him. He said, you know, Louis, I'm flattered, you know, I'm pleased, you know, that you want me to be head of the Princeton Institute for Advanced Studies, but you might want to rethink it, because the FBI has some files on me that are questionable. I don't think you'd like them, you know, very kind of derogatory in some ways, and I really think you ought to think about it. Maybe you don't want to recommend me to be appointed for that. So Oppie was very upfront about that, you know. And Strauss's response was, I don't care. I've seen those files. They don't bother me, and I still want to recommend you for that post. And in fact, he did, and Oppenheimer became the director there at Princeton in April of 1947. Unhappily, the relations between Strauss and Oppenheimer would turn around 180 degrees later on, as you will see. So he ran back and forth between Princeton and the GIC chairmanship, and was active in physics. This is very important, in 1947, given a renewed Q clearance. You got to think about these dates, because later on they're going to brand this guy as untrustworthy. Okay, so you've got to think about things like in 1947, he got his Q clearance renewed. Apparently they trusted him implicitly at that point. As we will see a little later, between 1947, anybody ever hear that date before? 1947 and about 1953, some other things seem to be happening in his professional life, and that those are things not widely spoken of, especially by the government, and there were storm clouds on the horizon for him. We're going to pass over those things for just a moment and just talk about some of the other things going on. Edward Teller was jumping up and down with eagerness, you know, to build an H-bomb. He was the big hawk, you know, on building the H-bomb. Oppie didn't think so. Oppie thought there are better things we ought to be doing. Okay, we need to be developing. Oppie actually thought we should be developing smaller tactical weapons. Okay, if we're going to actually do anything with atomic power, what's wrong with you know, small tactical weapons that'll, you know, you actually, you know, take into battle or something? But, you know, come on, an H-bomb, we're talking genocide, you know, when you start thinking about dropping that kind of thing on anybody. And Oppie wasn't really buying it, and many other people weren't either. It kind of got lost in the shuffle later on that Oppenheimer was not alone in this feeling about the H-bomb, but he's the one that ended up suffering for it, because it became an excuse. It became an excuse for them to say, see, you know, he's not with us at all. You know, he doesn't want to build the H-bomb, and so what did I tell you? You know, he sympathizes with our enemies, you know, and so forth and so on. Well, his term with the AEC was coming up for renewal in the summer of 1952, and who pops up but Teller? And Teller had a grudge, because when they were at Los Alamos, Oppie passed him over for appointment to head the theoretical division there at Los Alamos, and appointed Hans Bethe instead. Teller was still kind of wincing over that, you know, he still was holding a grudge about that. In fact, actually, not only that happened, but Hans Bethe actually asked him to leave the division altogether later on, because he wasn't, you know, towing the mark or something. And so Teller came out opposing Oppie's reappointment. Okay? And here's what he used as a reason. He said it's a personal vanity issue. Oppie's afraid that a weapon like the H-bomb that I want to build would trump his bomb. And can you believe anything could be that childish? Basically, Teller actually was saying, in effect, we're going to get into a kicking and spitting match here, and people are going to, it's like on a playground, you know, my bomb's bigger than yours, you know, I can out-explode you, you know, and that's what he said. That's essentially how he characterized Oppenheimer. He said Oppenheimer's just jealous that he can't build a bomb as big as I can. You know, God, give me a break. And no matter how idiotic that was, unfortunately, Eisenhower bought it. Okay, and so he declined to reappoint Oppenheimer to the GAC. More trouble ahead. Along comes this delusional idiot named William Liscombe Borden, a real zealot, a real doofus, executive director of a joint committee on atomic energy in Congress. Now look at that very carefully. We're not talking about science here. We're talking about stuff going on in Congress, okay? I mean, this guy, you know, probably, you know, had never taken a freshman physics class, all right? So here he's the head of this committee. He writes a letter in February '53 to the FBI accusing Oppenheimer of being, quote, more probably than not an agent of the Soviet Union. And Teller was right back there egging it on, right? This charge was absolutely untrue, but the letter did have its effect. Lewis Strauss kind of got into the ballgame. By now, Oppenheimer had made an enemy of him by humiliating and mocking him in front of a congressional committee one time. I told you, sometimes Oppie created his own problems. That was one time, you know, actually not strangely, Strauss never forgave him for doing that. I've seen that on film, by the way. It was a real trash job, you know, and Strauss never forgave him. And so they all kind of started getting together, and the plan was to kind of groom Edward Teller, to be the new science icon everybody looked up to, you know, and kind of start pushing Oppenheimer into the corner. And Borden in the letter also said that, this, you know, I just almost can't talk about this. This infuriates me to the point where actually I may have to go out in the hall, you know, and cool off for a minute before I continue, because what Borden said was, Oppenheimer has not made major contributions to the advancement of science. This guy wouldn't have known science if it walked up and bit him in the ass. He really wouldn't have. You know, this guy was basically a congressman who didn't know diddly squat about anything except serving on you know, silly committees and whatnot. And he has the nerve to pass judgment on Oppenheimer's professional competence. I find that so profoundly disgusting that I almost can't talk about it. The letter said these things. Oppie has no close friends except communists. Untrue. In frequent contact with Soviet espionage agents. Untrue. By the way, the FBI has checked all of this out over the years. They had him under surveillance for a long time, and none of this ever, you know, had the least shred of truth to it. Oppie worked tirelessly to retard the H-bomb program. Oppenheimer never said a word to anyone to the effect, don't work on the H-bomb project. All he told people was, I'm not going to work on it. Okay, I don't think it's a good idea. There are better things we ought to be doing, but if you want to work on it, that's up to you. Oppenheimer was a hardened communist who probably passed espionage information along with the Russians. Absolute garbage. In fact, here's, we talked the other day in one of my other lectures about what's wrong with the logic of cover-ups. Here's what's wrong with the logic here. I just read you a whole list of charges made in that letter against Oppenheimer. If those things had been true, Oppenheimer would have been arrested, tried, convicted, imprisoned, quite possibly executed for treason. I remember the execution of the Rosenbergs. That could have happened to him if any of that had been true. So why the hell did none of those things happen to him? Why did they just kind of pass this letter around and not do anything about it if it was true? It's like we're living in some kind of a never land of craziness or something. When a letter comes along like that, it'd be taken seriously, and yet they don't do anything to him except just plot, further machinations against him with the letter. But remember, these were the days of McCarthyism and paranoia and all kinds of weird thinking. Crazy things happened then. A woman lost her job because she had read the works of Lenin in a political science class, and those books were still on her bookshelf when the inquisitor came through and looked. A man lost his security clearance because someone discovered he was an atheist. Give me a break. Some people studying Russian language or literature were put on suspicion lists. I mean, that's the kind of crazy stuff. And by the way, in case you're wondering whether Oppenheimer and Senator McCarthy ever ended up in the same room together, no, they didn't, because people actively tried to avoid it. Everybody who cared anything about McCarthy at all, knew that if McCarthy and Oppenheimer ever ended up in the same room at the same time, Oppenheimer was going to rip him to shreds. Everybody had seen him do that to other people. And of course, McCarthy wasn't very bright to start with. It would have been basically child's play. So no, they never detangled directly. And then something kind of interesting happened. Eisenhower offered Louis Strauss, remember, is now conceived of an enmity for Oppenheimer, the chairmanship of the AEC. And Strauss replied that he wouldn't do it as long as Oppenheimer still had anything to do with America's nuclear program, with the weapons program. Strauss met with Ike on the 2nd of December, later in a book, in fact, lied about it, said he was never there. And they talked. He recommended to the president that a blank wall be erected between Oppenheimer and all government secrets, and the word all there is pretty important. And then they met again on December 3rd, and oddly enough, Strauss did admit going to this meeting. There were several people there, including a chap named Robert Cutler. It's very interesting for him to be there because he was up to his ears in UFO-related activity. There was a famous Cutler-Twining memo, that basically talks about the formation of Majestic 12 and so on. The subject of the meeting was Oppenheimer, and basically they decided right then and there to suspend Oppie's security clearance. He was traveling overseas and didn't find out until the 21st of December. He was given 1 day to decide, are you going to fight it or are you just going to walk away? And a lot of people that knew Oppenheimer advised him not to fight it. They said, you're just going to get mangled. These guys, you can't. You're not talking about people you can deal with rationally. These guys are going to mangle you. If you get into this. Einstein was of the opinion he shouldn't fight it. In fact, Einstein at the same time, Oppie decided to go ahead and fight it because he sent them a letter the next day, well within the deadline, saying, no, if I walk away, it's going to mean you guys are right, and I'd rather die, than have it suggested you guys are right. And so he decided to fight it. And when Einstein heard that, his remark was, Oppie's trouble is that he's in love with a woman who does not love him, and that's the United States government. That was his remark. So he decided to fight. And then, check this out. While they decided to start the hearings in April, okay, so he had several weeks, you know, to get ready. There we go. And during all that time, surveillance was set up on Oppenheimer's team, on his attorneys, and on his defense team. And everything they talked about in terms of preparing, you know, for the hearings and so forth was basically transmitted over to the other side, you know, to the attorneys for the AEC side, for the government side. And so basically, in other words, the side opposing Oppenheimer knew everything was going to be going on, all the plans being made to defend him and so forth. They would go into those hearings with the so-called, I might as well go ahead and call them prosecuting attorneys. They said it was not a trial, there was. Prosecuting attorneys were going to be cleared, able to stay in the room, able to listen to anything brought in. Oppie's attorneys would not be cleared, would not have clearances, would have to leave the room when any classified information was brought in, which it constantly was, of course. And essentially, Oppie's side was kept in the dark. Now, I'm telling you right now, if that kind of thing happened today, it would be Watergate. Okay? All of the people involved in it would end up being prosecuted. All right? Essentially, J. Edgar Hoover on down to the attorneys, to everybody involved, basically should have been prosecuted the same way the Watergate people were. Some of these people should have ended up in a slammer over this. Okay? I mean, it's a disgrace. But in the 1950s, remember, we're living in La La Land, you know, in the 1950s. They got away with it, you know, and so things just went right along. Here's something revealing. 2 decades later, the chief prosecuting attorney from the AEC, a fellow named Roger Robb, was asked if he would like to stand for the Supreme Court. Would you like to be nominated for the court? He turned it down. He said no, because he knew that if he let them nominate him, he'd have to go through of course, the hearings, right? The usual thing when someone's nominated for the court, and he couldn't survive it because all of that disgraceful behavior that happened during the Oppenheimer affair would come out in the process of vetting him for the Supreme Court. And so he said, don't even consider me. That's very telling when you think about it. But the hearings went forward. They started on the 12th of April. They ran up to the 6th of May. It's about 3.5 weeks. I've read through the available transcripts. They're about 1,000 pages. I've gone through them line by line, word by word, comma by comma. That's only a small portion of the original documents. The rest is still classified. Okay? In the end, he did not succeed. The security board there refused to reinstate his clearance, and basically he was sent back to Princeton and was never to work for the government again. Okay? See, the thing is, in his field, you take somebody's clearance away, they're finished. Finished. I mean, you know, what are you going to do? Go make atomic bombs for General Electric? You know, if you're not making nuclear weapons for the government, you know, you're not making it for anybody, you know. So, of course, he was done. He was finished when they took the clearance away and he failed to get it back. Let's talk about the real reasons why it happened. Oddly enough, the real reasons begin in Canada. There was a fellow named Wilbert Smith. He was an engineer, a radio engineer, actually, and it all revolves around what I call the SSS correspondence, because all the people's names happen to start with S. And that would be Wilbert Smith and a fellow named Sarbacher and a fellow named Steinman. Smith was a senior radio engineer for what was later called Canada's Department of Communications. He had information, he had access to classified information. And on the 21st of November 1950, he wrote a top-secret memo to the Canadian government urging them that they ought to have a program studying the possible magnetic propulsion capabilities of UFOs, because there was some suspicion that some UFOs used, you know, magnetic systems for propulsion. The Canadian government said yes. They accepted the idea. They put him in charge. And essentially, for 4 years, he was in charge of that program. And the Canadian government declassified that original memo in 1978. Can you imagine that? If that memo had been issued in the United States, it would never be declassified, ever. So why can the Canadian government, I mean, what are they doing? They're admitting, you know, there's such a thing as a UFO. We're interested in them. You know, we think it makes sense to study them and to look into the whole question. Why can the government of Canada admit that and the government of the United States cannot? I'm just asking. You know, I mean, certainly if they can do it, we should be able to do it too. But here's why that's important. In the original memo, he said there's a small group headed by a Dr. Vannevar Bush that is already studying propulsion systems in the United States, UFO propulsion. And here's why that was said. Before actually issuing the memo, Wilbur Smith traveled to Washington and met with a fellow named Robert Sarbacher. And Sarbacher was a scientific advisor to the Pentagon. He kept an office at the Pentagon and an office at Harvard. Smith met with him on the 15th of December 1950, kept careful notes of their meeting, and here's something Smith said to Sarbacher: I understand the whole subject of saucers is classified. Sarbacher says, yes, it is classified 2 points higher even than the H-bomb. In fact, it is the most highly classified subject in the U.S. government at the present time. Okay? And Smith actually used all of that as ammunition, you know, when he turned his memo in, and it kind of helped convince the Canadian government, yeah, we ought to go ahead with this, which they did. Well, okay, in 1978, when the memo was declassified, there was a very prominent and well-known UFO investigator named Lynn Stringfield, highly respected investigator, who got hold of Smith's notes and that declassified document and took them to a fellow named William Steinman, who was actually intensely interested in the Aztec UFO incident. Steinman himself wrote to Sarbacher with some questions about that small group of researchers. And Sarbacher wrote back and said, okay, you know, there are researchers like that. These guys are looking into crash discs all the time. This is an ongoing thing, okay? He said that meetings of scientists like that are held frequently at Wright Field in Ohio, which we would later call Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And some of the people were John von Neumann, who was, by the way, a mathematician, who was a computer pioneer, okay? And Dr. Vannevar Bush, and he says, I think Dr. Robert Oppenheimer also. The fact that Oppenheimer seems to have been at those meetings, now keep in mind we're talking about highly classified stuff here, and for him to be at those meetings at all required two things. He had to have the right clearance, which of course he had, and he had to have the eternal, what? Need to know, okay? And the only way he could have had the need to know would have been if he was or was about to be involved in UFO retrieval activity. That's the only thing that would have justified his being at those meetings. Believe me, when classified information is involved, if they don't think you have a need to know, it doesn't matter how highly cleared you are, how high your clearance is, you're not going to get in. You're not going to be told anything if they don't think you have a need to know. Okay? Think about what happened in early July 1947 right here. The Roswell crash, right? Put yourself in Harry Truman's shoes. You get a phone call in the wee hours of the morning, and somebody's telling you, oh my God, Mr. President, this thing has crashed out in the desert, and we don't know what to do, you know, we're awaiting your orders. Well, you know, Truman would figure that he had probably 30 seconds to decide what to do, you know. And certainly, of course, he would say, okay, the military's got to come in, the military's got to cordon the area off and kind of take charge, but we're going to have civilian scientists in here. That would be almost automatic, I think. And what name do you suppose would come to his mind early on? I mean, it's got to be somebody already cleared, because they're not about to let somebody not cleared for top secret anywhere near that site. You know, it's got to be somebody who is a physicist, probably, or a scientist of some kind, and knows what to do, how to think about it. Well, of course, Oppenheimer would be the natural choice, so I think we can assume that Oppenheimer would have been asked to go. Okay. But there's even clearer reason to think that Oppenheimer was on hand at the event a year later, the Aztec event, because we actually have witnesses for that. Witnesses who placed Oppenheimer there. Okay, William Steinman wrote a very important book called The UFO Crash at Aztec. There it is. Now, I got to tell you about this book, why it is that I trust it. Steinman has a lot of witnesses that he doesn't identify, okay? And normally that would kind of run a red flag up in the back of my head, you know. I would think, well, wait a minute. He's saying that so-and-so said this, and somebody said that, and somebody said something else, but he's not telling us who any of these witnesses are. You know, that makes me a little nervous. But see, the foreword of this book was written by Len Stringfield. Now, I can tell you, Len Stringfield was a very, very, very no-nonsense guy, okay? If Len Stringfield had the slightest inclination to think that Steinman wasn't really quite on the mark with any of this, he would have said so. As a matter of fact, he did criticize Steinman. Usually somebody writing a foreword to a book doesn't do that, but he did actually criticize Steinman in the foreword to the book, saying, you know, it really would have been nice if you could have identified more of your witnesses. I understand you can't, because witness confidentiality is a sacred trust in this business. I know you can't do it, but it would have been nice if the readers could have known who some of these people were. But the point is, Steinman did tell Stringfield who most of the witnesses were, okay? And in fact, Stringfield not only, you know, talked to most of them, but actually chased down a lot of his own witnesses. So we've got somebody very trustworthy, very capable, kind of behind all this. I'm talking about Stringfield himself. Okay. Basically, here's what happened. We'll just go over this quickly. What happened at Aztec? Radar tracks showed something down east of Aztec, a few miles. Around 25th of March 1948, a message went out to the Secretary of State and to MJ-12, we'll talk about a little later. The Secretary of State alerted, believe it or not, there was actually an organization called the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit. Sounds like something straight out of science fiction, right? It's not, because Richard Hall actually validated this through a Freedom of Information Act request. They were based at a place that was later going to be a CIA training base at Camp Hale, Colorado. Two things happened. The IPU dispatched a military team to do the usual thing, cordon the area off and keep everybody out. You know, that's standard pretty much. The object that was reported was a dome disk about 100 feet in diameter, actually 99 feet in diameter. And a kind of commando-style outfit did the military part, but a civilian scientist group was also sent in, okay? There were witnesses to all this, not only to the fact that such a team went in, but to the fact that certain specific people were on that team. They were sent in and told, look at this stuff, you know, examine the hardware, the bodies, and so forth. Vannevar Bush would head the team up, and the team also included John von Neumann, again, Dr. Detlef Bronk, who was at one time president of Johns Hopkins University. Some other people died. Lloyd Bergner was a geophysicist, and some other folks. And finally, Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer was there. They assembled at the airfield in Durango, Colorado, some 35 miles by unimproved dirt roads. And trust me, out there, you know, when somebody tells you roads are unimproved, they are. North of the site, and they went to the place that was cordoned off. They found charred bodies, which Dr. Bronk examined. That's what he was there to do. They found instrument panels with symbols that Oppenheimer thought were like Sanskrit, which, remember, is a language he was familiar with. Interestingly, those texts were sent, they were on like plastic-like pages. They were sent to famous cryptanalyst William Friedman. And Friedman was asked to try to decipher them, and if he ever did, we don't know. If he ever did, the results are classified. Surprise, you know, can you imagine him declassifying and telling you what they said? If anything happened, that stuff was classified. And finally, all of that stuff was shipped up to Los Alamos. Oppie, of course, would be the perfect person to have on hand to do that. Oppenheimer knew the Los Alamos facility like the back of his hand. You know, he could have said, you know, drive down this alley, turn right here, go to this loading dock, you know, and do exactly this, and that's what, you know, Oppenheimer knew that site very well. And as I said, Stringfield found his own witnesses, including a prominent Air Force officer who didn't end up getting identified, but everybody said that everybody would be stupefied if they knew who it was. Another kind of secondary witness said that there had been a propulsion system at Aztec that, if made known generally, in other words, if this thing were actually just given over to the world, basically it would destroy, oil would be obsolete. The internal combustion engine would be obsolete, which of course it is anyway, but oil would just be a comic memory, okay? Basically, they said if you had this kind of propulsion system, you wouldn't need anything else. And you can imagine Oppenheimer's eyes lighting up at that. Oppenheimer was an energy physicist. This was his field, you know, basically. He would have looked at that and thought, okay, ready to rock and roll. You know, what we need to be doing is actually chasing that down as a way of powering the world. And I think that got him in trouble because there are people around that don't want you to do that. Okay. Right after the Roswell incident, President Truman decided he needed to have a long-term group, you know, to both civilian and military people to look over UFO-related activities. And that group will be called MJ-12, Majestic 12. There's been some controversy about that. There are people that don't think MJ-12 is legitimate. They think that all of the documents that support it are bogus and so forth. Stanton Friedman and some others have done some excellent work actually authenticating all of that. I'm inclined to side, you know, with Stanton over this. I think that MJ-12 was real. I think it still is under another name. We don't know what that name is. Of course, it's classified as that was. The people on that were pretty impressive. I'll tell you why I've got asterisks by some of them. Admiral Roscoe Hillenkotter, Dr. Vannevar Bush, Secretary of Defense James Forrestal, who died in '49, supposed suicide, not a suicide, murder. That's a whole different story. Replaced by General Walter Smith. The other people were Nathan Twining, who, by the way, was almost certainly called to the Roswell crash to look at things. General Hoyt Vandenberg, Dr. Detlef Brock, who's again a geophysicist, a biophysicist. Dr. Jerome Hunziker, who was an aeronautical engineer at MIT. Mr. Sidney Sowers, Mr. Gordon Gray, hang on to that name, we're going to refer to it later. Donald Menzel, who was a professional hypocrite. What can I tell you? This guy wrote books debunking UFOs and served on Majestic 12, you know. General Robert Montague, who was associated with the White Sands Missile Range, an accomplished mathematician. Lloyd Berkner was once head of the Geophysical Year project in the late 50s. Very impressive people, and the reason why 4 of those people have asterisks by their name is that those 4 people were with Oppie at Aztec. Okay? And again, Gordon Gray we're going to refer to again. I'm going to kind of pass through this because we've already kind of said who they are. There's the overlap. Those 4 people, you know, were at Aztec at the same time Oppenheimer was. Here's a government document that talks about a panel convening to discuss UFO-related matters. There's Oppie's name on it, in case anybody wants to know, was he ever involved in anything related to UFOs? He was. And we get to the hearings. Remember, you know, they yanked his clearance and they decided, okay, if you're willing, we'll give you a chance to try to get it back. It sounds like some kind of a game show or something when you put it that way. See if you can get your clearance back. It was, believe me, though, it's not a joke. I mean, it was a very grueling process. And everybody kept saying, this is not a trial. You're not on trial. Well, I'm here to tell you, yes, it was. This was a trial. He was on trial. He walks in, and here's this board of people, this personnel security board, running the whole show, and guess who's sitting there chairing that committee? Gordon Gray of MJ-12. When I first saw that name, I thought, nah, it couldn't be the same Gordon Gray. Surely not, And I checked it out, and it was. It is the same guy. And I can imagine I'll be kind of going, oh, Christ, look who this is. Boy, am I screwed. Here's Gordon Gray sitting here. He knows everything I've ever been involved with all of this highly classified, UFO crash retrieval stuff. And here he sits pontificating over my life. Well, the hearings ran for 3.5 weeks. As I think I mentioned, the published transcripts run about 1,000 pages. There are tens of thousands of other pages of stuff still classified. Okay? I tried FOIA requests. You just get the runaround. They send you from one agency to another and basically just kind of jerk it around when you ask for this stuff. The Gordon Gray papers reside in a special collection at the Dwight D. Eisenhower Library in Abilene, Kansas. And if you go there and check into it, you're going to find out that Gray, as a condition to contributing those papers, specified that the Oppenheimer transcript papers be permanently withheld from research. Permanently, forever. No one is ever to see them. Why would that be? Gee, what could they be about? What could have gone on in those closed hearing rooms, that we're not supposed to know anything about? The Eisenhower Library's own description, because you can look up, you can look, in the card catalog, and here they are, the papers are listed, you can't see them, but the papers, of course, are indexed and filed. And what it says about them is Series 4 of the J. Robert Oppenheimer case, 1954 to 75, an odd thing because he died in 67, I'm not quite sure when they did that. I guess they just kept on, keeping records on him after he was dead. Has a subseries B that consists of the, quote, PSB Personnel Security Board hearing transcripts and has been withdrawn in its entirety. These transcripts contain unpublished portions which may relate to national security. I kind of have to wonder why that's still true. I can maybe see why it might have been true at one time. Why is it still? Unless it's about stuff that is still classified. We all know what kind of stuff that is. Basically, again, my hypothesis is that the issue at those hearings was really the crash retrieval thing. It's interesting when you read through the transcripts that are available, 1,000 pages or so, that if you're thinking that way, if you're thinking, okay, what they've really got in this guy is that he knows about things classified 2 notches above the H-bomb, and he's got some funny kind of personality traits and some politics that we're not all that crazy about. And we really kind of want to know, should we keep him in the loop? Should we keep him continuing to be able to access information like that? When you look at it that way, a lot of stuff in those transcripts sounds very different. Very different. Okay? It's too much to go into in detail. I urge you to please read my book about it if you want to see, what happened during that 3.5 weeks. Here's some highlights. Oppie, in his own defense, denied ever having been a communist. Swore he'd never discouraged anyone from working on the H-bomb. True. All he said was, "I'm not going to work on it. I think there are better things we should be doing, but I'm not going to work on it. But you want to work on it? Go ahead. That's your choice." At one point, Oppenheimer said at the hearings, "Look, I've had a lot of secrets in my head a long time." And of course, that's quite true, but I don't think people realize what kinds of secrets. He was asked why he had so mismanaged that Hakon Chevalier business, the one I told you he delayed telling anybody about it and then didn't tell them the names even when he did. And he said, "Because I was an idiot." In other words, he realized at that point it was an indiscretion, it was poor judgment, and he admitted it. And that should have been the end of it. They should have said, well, that's the only thing we've really got is a complaint against him, but that wasn't the only thing because they were nervous about him continuing to know about you-know-what. Leslie Groves testified that Oppie had done a magnificent job as far as the war effort was concerned and said, I would not clear Dr. Oppenheimer today. That's kind of strange. What happened between, say, 1945 and 1954? I can think of a couple of things. The Roswell crash, the Aztec incident, heaven knows what else. You know, certainly General Groves' whole thinking about Oppie had turned around 180 degrees over that period somehow. Although, you know, you can't find anything that Oppenheimer did wrong. There's no reason why he should have changed his thinking in that way. Here's something funny. Roger Robb, who was the chief, I call it prosecuting attorney, might as well call it that, asked Oppenheimer in the middle of the hearings, would you have supported the dropping of a thermonuclear bomb, in other words, an H-bomb, on Hiroshima? Oppie actually laughed and said, no, it would have made no sense at all. And when they asked him why, he said, because the target was too small. See, if they could even ask him that question, they didn't have the faintest damned idea what kind of weapon that is. You know, an H-bomb's not a tactical weapon. You don't drop an H-bomb on a machine gun nest. Okay, you don't drop an H-bomb on a bridge. You know, you drop an H-bomb on a country. You know, when they tested the H-bomb at Bikini, it made a crater in the ocean floor 20 miles across and a mile deep, even with a mile and a half of water to cushion it. You know, that's not a tactical weapon. You know, and Oppenheimer basically just said, you know, even to ask me a question like that, you have to be an idiot. You know, you have to have no idea what kind of weapon we're talking about. Oppie also referred to, quote, a great deal that happened between 45 and 49. I am not supposed to say to what extent. Well, again, I think we can all think of things that happened between 1945 and 1949. Hans Bethe testified on Oppie's behalf, saying that Oppie had always been very security-minded and loyal, especially given the scientists don't always think that way. So it was kind of actually a plus, you know, that Oppenheimer always did think that way. You know, security, you know, first and so on. Naturally, a scientist would see that in Oppenheimer, you know, as one scientist to another. David Lilienthal said, okay, here's the question, you know, if basically the Chevalier matter, for example, wasn't any big deal in 1943, and notice you guys didn't keep Oppie from working on the Manhattan Project because of that in 1943, then why the hell is it a big deal now? What's the deal? You know, of course, nobody could answer that. Columbia University physicist A. Robbie testified, we have an A-bomb and a whole series of it, and what more do you want, mermaids? Basically, the guy hands you the bomb with a ribbon tied around it. What do you want? You know? Norris Bradbury, the new director of Los Alamos, said that to question the integrity and loyalty of a person who has worked as hard and devotedly for his country as Dr. Oppenheimer has on such trivial grounds is against all principles of human justice. Dr. Vannevar Bush. Now here's something interesting. Remember, Vannevar Bush was MJ-12, okay? So is Gordon Gray. The difference is, Gordon Gray was a hack, you know, and Vannevar Bush was a scientist. That's the difference, okay? You know, with Vannevar Bush, it was one scientist evaluating another. And he said, I worked with him on many occasions on many difficult matters. Boy, I guess that's true. One of those difficult matters, of course, had to be the Aztec retrieval. In fact, Bush actually became so adamant about it that he told the panel, here's a man who's being pilloried because he has strong opinions and had the temerity to express them. He went so far as to say that you guys are not even very bright for agreeing to sit on this board. You know, when the AEC asked you guys to sit on this board, if you had any brains, you would have said no. Okay, and in fact, if you want to prosecute people for having their own opinions and speaking them, then start prosecuting me. That's how Vannevar Bush came across, even though he had been Majestic 12. And there was a lot of talk about communism. Kitty Oppenheimer actually tried to explain it. It's like talking to the cat, you know, pretty much. But she tried to explain that, you know, in the 1930s, we didn't have all this, we didn't have any Cold War with the Soviet Union or anything like that yet. What we basically had was a certain kind of political thinking that did things like favor the underdog, you know, that kind of thing. And it was not the same thing as being, you know, a Russian double agent, you know, in the 1950s and 1960s. And you guys are talking as if sort of social communism, so to speak, in the 1930s was the same thing as political communism in the 50s and 60s. It's not the same thing. You know, but nobody seemed to be able to grasp that. Of course, they did grasp it. But remember, this is all about something different than what it's supposed to be about. Remember, anytime classified stuff was brought in, Oppenheimer's people had to leave the room, and who knows, you know, if we had that other, you know, good many thousands of pages of transcripts, we'd probably read a great deal being said about things that were not mentioned in the published part. Mathematician, computer pioneer John von Neumann testified that Oppie was like everybody else. He had to make adjustments. Scientists were not used to working in security situations where you had to think about questions of, you know, your loyalty and your oaths, you know, to keep everything quiet and so on. And he said, scientists, quote, got suddenly in contact with a universe we had not known before. And that Oppenheimer had taken some time, quote, to get adjusted to this Buck Rogers universe. It's kind of an interesting choice of words, you know, when you think about it. That's what I mean, that's what I meant before when I said, if you read back through these transcripts with in mind that Oppenheimer had been in some crash retrievals, and that's probably what this was all about, a lot of things do sound different. Edward Teller, who was, of course, pathologically jealous of Oppenheimer, testified against him. Remember, you know, Teller was being groomed to replace Oppie, essentially, as the science icon. And on his way out of the room, Teller extended a hand to Oppie, and Oppie did shake his hand. Teller says, "I'm sorry." Oppie said, "Well, after what you just said, I don't know what you mean when you say you're sorry." Say what you mean. You know? William Liscombe Borden, who's this psychopath in Congress who basically, you know, wrote that letter about the, you know, about Oppie's being a communist and being you know, in touch with Russian agents and so forth and so on, was allowed for some reason to read the letter into the record. However, even Gordon Gray didn't buy it. I mean, it even grossed him out. You know, Gordon Gray said, that is in no way going to broaden the inquiry of this board. So even he thought it was garbage, which it was. But you got to remember through all this that the real concerns were something else, not what everybody is saying. The hearings ended. A letter was sent to the general manager, Kenneth Nichols, who was supposed to just pass it on. That was his job. Just take the letter, look at it, pass it on. He didn't. He rewrote everything. He found new reasons to not recommend Oppie, including things like things having to do with his character and his behavior. He wasn't even supposed to tamper with those results. It's kind of like, you know, you go to court and the jury, you know, gives the judge a statement, the judge makes a decision, and then somebody in between, you know, takes the whole thing and rewrites it or something. You know, that's what happened. And he said that better behavior was expected of somebody who had customarily had access to information of the highest classification. Now remember what Starbucker said that was. That was not weaponry, all right? That was not military information per se. That was something classified 2 points higher than the H-bomb, in his own words, right? So instead of just passing along, he rewrote it and made remarks about Oppie's character and veracity. And in the end, they voted not to give the clearance back, and so he was basically out of government service forever altogether. Here's something that's never been pointed out before. I think, I'm pretty sure I'm the first person to ever notice this. The written decision says, quote, "A government official having access to the most sensitive areas of restricted data and to the innermost details of national war plans and weapons must measure up to exemplary standards." I'm going to read that a little differently and pause in the right places. A government official having access to the most sensitive areas of restricted data and to the innermost details of national war plans and weapons must measure up. Okay, either this is really klutzy writing, or what this writer is saying is that the most sensitive areas of restricted data and the innermost details of national war plans and weapons are two different things. I think we caught them. This is a Freudian slip if I ever saw one. Okay? Remember what Sarbacher said. 2 notches above the H-bomb. Okay, we are talking about 2 different things here. After the hearings, Oppenheimer went back to Princeton to run the Institute for Advanced Studies. Louis Strauss, such a sterling gentleman, followed him there and tried to get him fired. Said, you don't want Oppie to run the Institute. Princeton told him to take a walk, buzz off. We don't need any advice from you. And so Oppie stayed. He didn't like to talk about the hearings very much. He once told a reporter that the hearing was a train wreck. And a very interesting thing, he said there was a story behind the story. Now, the reporter did ask him, of course, well, what was the story behind the story? And Oppie said, I can't tell you. So see, you see what this says about his real character? Even after they dumped on him, big time, he wouldn't disclose anything that he wasn't supposed to talk about. Isn't that ironic? In '63, President Kennedy invited Oppenheimer to the White House to accept the Fermi Award in physics. Kennedy was assassinated before he could give the award out, and Lyndon Johnson gave it instead. But so ticked off that Oppie had won the prize, there was an Iowa senator who tried to introduce legislation mandating that Congress be allowed to pick the winner. Can you imagine that? A bunch of half-assed lawyers, deciding who should get the Fermi Award. It's like asking a toenail fungus, who should get a Nobel Prize, I mean, my God. But even in Congress, they didn't buy it. They defeated it. All right? Oppie died on the 18th of February, 1967, just a few weeks short of his 63rd birthday, of throat cancer. At his funeral, the Juilliard String Quartet played Beethoven's C-sharp minor quartet number 14, and pretty much an era had come to an end. And as usual with things like this, the logic is all wrong, when you look back over it. That's the funny thing about all these things that they do, cover-ups and deceptions and so forth. The logic never is right. It never is, because they don't really, first of all, they're not bright enough to get it right. And secondly, they don't have time. If you spend a year or something scripting everything and making sure everything's going to be seamless forever, nobody's ever going to be able to pick a hole in it, they can never do that. So we do pick the holes. We do pick the holes in it, and we can do that, and we do it. The notion that he was banished from government because of his running a little tiff, with Teller about the H-bomb, preposterous, easily refuted. The real reasons, of course, were something else altogether. The main logical issue, of course, is it's okay for him to run the Manhattan Project in 1943, and he was given a new Q clearance in 1947. All of a sudden, he can't be trusted in 1954. Although, and if you ask him, well, then point to something as a reason, point to something he's done, why can't you trust him anymore? Nobody can point to anything, really, anything meaningful. And of course, we all know what had happened in between those years. And the simple fact is, they just didn't want him in the loop anymore. And of course, there's another angle. Remember that propulsion system at Aztec? If Oppie had actually been allowed to pick up on that and say, okay, let's really make the internal combustion engine obsolete, which it really is anyway, and let's just tell the oil companies, learn to do something new or move over. Should they be able to? I don't have any respect for them if they can't. It's been done before. You know what happened when slide rules went out and little calculators came in? The companies that made slide rules started making calculators. That's the kind of adjustment you make. And if you can't make it, you should get out. Okay, that's the way I feel, about that. And essentially, if he had been able to actually take that new propulsion system and really run with it the way he wanted to, no doubt, there would have been lobby interest, right? There would have been, politicians bought by the oil companies, who would have said, no, we don't buy it. And of course, he would have been in a world of trouble, even just for that. Okay? I don't have time to get into this, but the real irony is there isn't any legal basis for any of this secrecy. Do you know that? I bet you thought that there were laws about secrecy. There aren't. There's not a word in the United States Constitution about keeping secrets. Well, I take it back. There is one reference in the Constitution that says each branch of Congress can keep a journal which they can withhold from public view if they feel they need to. That's the only reference in the whole Constitution to secrecy. There's nothing in statutory law, there's nothing in appellate law about secrecy. Nothing. Okay? Where does it all come from? From executive orders. You go back and just look at something like Clinton's Executive Order 12958, which redefines what top secret is, what confidential. That's where all this stuff comes from. It's just executive orders, and there's nothing in the Constitution that says that a president can issue an executive order. Think about that. Okay? Most of the people are not aware of that. And when you think of what can happen, I've just shown you what can happen to somebody like Oppenheimer. It's really pretty scary. It's pretty scary. It's something somebody can be, to use Vannevar Bush's term, pilloried for the kinds of reasons given, and the reasons aren't even the right ones. The public is never allowed to know what the real reasons were. That's really shabby when you think about it. Secrecy is a scary thing. Now, don't get me wrong. There are times when secrecy is necessary. Okay? There really are. But if secrecy is excessive, if it's not necessary, if it's irrational, if it's duplicitous, if it's deceitful, then secrecy has the power to make victims of all of us. And you know, that might just be another reason to read some meaning into that verse from the Bhagavad Gita that was a favorite of Oppenheimer. I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Thank you. Do we have time for some questions, Dennis?
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody have questions?
I don't have a question, but
Oh.
I have a comment.
Let me hear your non-question.
What I realized is, yeah, that, yeah, you have to ask, that man, Borden.
Yeah, Borden.
His name is Lincomb?
His name is, his middle name was Liscombe.
Listen,
Borden. I've kind of wondered whether he was related to Lizzie Borden. You know, maybe he should have been.
that's what I'm bringing up. She had an uncle called John Vincomb Morris. They seem to tend to use Latin words. I just thought maybe.
Well, yeah, actually, I was only joking about him being related maybe to Lizzie Borden, you know, but maybe he was.
It's not important, but it's
I know, but yeah, he could have been. If he wasn't, he's certainly in spirit, you know, because he was a real weasel. You know, he really was. Questions? Yeah.
Was he a German or a Jew?
Who?
Oppenheimer.
Oppenheimer was a non-practicing Jew. He was not religious. He was Jewish by birth. His family were non-practicing Jews. Well, if no other questions, then yeah.
The one person in Majestic Falls named Detlef.
Yeah. Detlef Bronk.
Definitely German. Is he German? Like, did he come from here? Did he come from Germany, or was he?
He was not he's not like a recent immigrant or anything. His family had been around for quite a while. He was actually president, I think I mentioned, was president of Johns Hopkins University for a while, and some other places, and had a very illustrious record. In fact, all of the people in Majestic 12 had track records that were dazzling. I mean, those people were very accomplished people. My very strong guess is Truman would have needed to consult, would have needed consultants to pick those people. I mean, Truman was a bright guy. I remember very well. Believe me, he was a bright chap, you know. But he was not a scientist, and I think he would have needed to ask some consultants. Okay, if I'm going to put together a group like that to look at UFO stuff, you know, like what kinds of people should be on it. And some consultant would say, well, you need a biophysicist. And then some other consultant would say, I know the guy, you know, Detlef Bronk. Well, you need an aeronautical engineer. I know the guy, Jerome Hunziker, you know, and I'm sure that he probably leaned on consultants, you know, pretty heavily to put that group together. The question is sometimes raised: why wasn't Oppie on the group?
Yeah. Why was Mendel on?
And my suspicion is simply that the advisors that were surrounding the president at that time didn't trust him. That's my suspicion. It's just a suspicion. That would be my guess. Okay? The lady in the back.
Well, it's two questions. One, I wonder how much anti-Semitism was a running undercurrent in some of the automatic behaviors of people not knowing any better.
You mean like at the hearings?
Well, just wherever there was discord.
The question is, you know, was there maybe an element of anti-Semitism here? It's conceivable. You know, certainly, you know, it's possible.
Because the logic I'm running from is, I used to work at White House Missile Range back in the early 80s, and they showed us some training films, because I was in the radiation protection area.
Mm-hmm.
They showed us some training films of old footage of what was going on in Los Alamos and stuff. And they represented him to be, part of his motivation for the bomb was because of the annihilation of the Jews in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was driving behind him. And forgive me if you shared some of this one in front of you.
Well, the thing about Los Alamos was the people working in the bomb of Los Alamos were scared to death that the Nazis were going to get there first. Actually, the Nazis weren't anywhere close to developing a bomb by the time they were out of the war. But that was a driving force. It was common talk around the camp, you know, from Oppie and other people. Hey, you guys, you know, don't slack off, because for all you know, that little psychotic prick, you know, with the mustache, you know, has probably got a bomb like that already. Unless you will have tomorrow or the next day, you know, if you don't get it done. And that was a real driving force. They didn't really have any way of knowing that that essentially, you know, the Nazis were not even close to developing something like that. But it was a legitimate way to think, because for all you knew, they might have been close. You know?
The other comment I want to make is that the sense I got from seeing those films back when I was in my 20s was that Oppenheimer was the first anti-nuclear protester. He didn't want, the sense was that he didn't want them dropped. And I just spun at what I just said, that he saw the potential, the destruction, the annihilation, and I think he read into it more than we dropped.
Well, yeah, the thing about looking at Oppie as maybe, you know, one of the first anti-nuclear, you know, people in a sense, is that, remember, when Truman asked him and his colleagues, you know, should we just maybe make a show of this or should we really drop it? Oppie was one of the people saying, we got to really drop it. Well, that's why we built the damn thing. You know, we've got to drop it, because otherwise nobody's going to believe us, you know, that we can do it. Yeah. But Oppie, when Teller started raving and ranting about the H-bomb, Oppie said, well, you know, wait a minute. I mean, you know, you can't have a weapon like that unless your intention is to wipe out an entire population. And I don't think anybody has the right to do that.
That may have been the point that I was seeing there, attributed to the A-bomb instead of H. But the thing is, Oppie was very fair about it. He told people, I'm certainly not going to work on the thing, but if you want to work on it, you can square that with your conscience, then go ahead and work on it. You know. Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, if no other questions, I will turn it over to Dennis for closing remarks.
Thank you, Don. This brings an end to the Roswell 2012 conference. First of all, we want to thank you for being here and supporting all the speakers. On behalf of all the speakers, including myself, we want to thank you. I think this is one of the best locations in Roswell to do lectures, as far as comfort and the size of the room and things like that. And we thank the Roswell Museum and Arts Center for allowing us to be here. We hope you enjoyed your time here. We hope you've learned something while you were here. And enjoy your visit while you're in Roswell. Stay cool. Have a safe trip back home, wherever that is. Thank you all for coming.